Before week 7 begins, there's a couple of players that you should be trading away on your fantasy teams right now. Now, it doesn't mean these guys are bad players, but they might be at their peak value level right now, so it's time to sell high. And the first guy I want to talk about here is J.K. Dobbins, who saw an elite role in week 6. I can't lie to you, he came out of his bye week and he saw a fantastic role for the Los Angeles Chargers. You can see right here, he sees 73% of the snaps, a season high. He handles 68% of the rush attempts, but when you take out wide receiver and quarterback runs, this was 80% of the backfield carries, which for J.K. Dobbins to this point in the season, a man coming back from multiple gruesome injuries, that was also a season high. So there's no denying that the role was strong and really has been strong for the past month or so for Dobbins, but he had the perfect game script in this one. The Chargers were up by multiple scores over the Broncos for the far majority of the game. Now, entering this week, there was some hype around the late round rookie Kamani Vidal. We had some preseason and training camp hype around him. He ended up making the team, but we didn't really see much from him from the start of the year. But since Gus Edwards got placed on IR and will miss at least 4 weeks, well, this past week, we got the debut of Kamani Vidal. We talked about him in the running back ads. I think he's an exciting rookie, but he didn't see all that much playing time this past week. Like, just getting anything from him was exciting if you're a dynasty owner or somebody who thinks that he can see a larger role towards the end of the year. But for right now, just 24% of the snaps, 11% of the rush attempts in this game. Sure, he did see his first ever touch in the NFL go for a 38-yard touchdown. He's an explosive player, but overall, he's not like cutting into dramatically J.K. Dobbins' role. And as we enter week 7, J.K. Dobbins has another really nice matchup. Now, he'll go on the road, but he is a favorite in this one against the Cardinals, which sets up nicely for Dobbins to once again have a neutral or favorable game script for him to be getting more carries like he did this past week. And the matchup in general against Arizona is good because so far this season, they allow the 4th most rushing yards per play. So yes, Dobbins is a must start. Put him in your lineups this week. And you might be saying, Sal, why the heck is he in a trade away video? Well, I just want to get into those details right now. I think you keep J.K. Dobbins on your team for this week in this nice matchup where he's a favorite against the Cardinals. But after this game, assuming he has just 10 plus fantasy points or more, that's when you trade him away. Because look, J.K. Dobbins is getting the workload. We just went into how good of a role he just saw coming out of the bye week. He's healthy too. He's healthy for now. I should put that caveat in there. Like, but look at this, 27 touches, right? 27 touches. He has 25 carries on the ground in a tough matchup against Denver. Doesn't crack 100 yards, and that's somewhat of the concern here. Like, all of this is good in terms of the overall touches, but here's my concern in general. I mentioned he's healthy right now. This is a guy coming off of an Achilles injury. Normally, coming off of an Achilles injury is your strongest at the beginning of the year for a couple of games, and then your efficiency wears off. And that's somewhat what we're seeing right now out of Dobbins, who started the year hot the first 2 games of the season, breaking tackles left and right, but now over his next 3 games, he currently ranks 47th in broken tackle rate. Now, 47th in broken tackle rate, it's not the worst thing in the world overall, but it's showing an efficiency or a lack thereof, and we're only in week 6 or 7. And he's also 23rd in yards per route run amongst running backs, not really efficient as a pass catcher. In this past week, we saw the rookie Kamani Vidal get involved in a pretty major way as a receiver out of the backfield. So the efficiency isn't there right now, and if we actually see this workload drop from, 27 carries in the game to maybe now he's only getting like 15, 16 total touches, and you're still only averaging 3.5, 4 yards per carry, and you're not breaking a ton of tackles, you start to become a touchdown or bust player like he was, back in week 3. Now, I get it. Emotionally, you spent a late round pick on this guy, or maybe you picked him up off the waiver wire, so the fact that he gave you a running back 4, a running back 5 performance to start the year, and now coming out of his bye week goes for another 100 total yards and a running back 13 performance, like, these are 3 really good performances out of 5 weeks. I get it emotionally wise, since he really didn't cost you much in fantasy this year, that you're like, I might as well just keep him on my team. But that's not the way you should be thinking. You should be thinking, how can I improve my team for the long haul? And I think one way to do that is by trading J.K. Dobbins, who right now to me is the 59th overall player in fantasy football, meaning if I scroll up here and you can get a Deontay Johnson for him, probably can't get that done, but a Brian Thomas for J.K. Dobbins is the perfect trade off of Brian Thomas's worst week and only bad week of the season. Scroll up a little bit more. Chris Olave currently dealing with a concussion. Derek Carr should be back in 2 weeks. Rashid Shaheed gonna miss maybe the entire season. That's somebody I would go out there and target in trades to upgrade your teams. Josh Jacobs, if you can get that one done, immediately go and pull the trigger on these trades. It doesn't mean you sell low on J.K. Dobbins. No, you're trying to get a better, more consistent player moving forward. And that same logic is the case with this next guy, Najee Harris, who is coming off of by far his best season of, or the best game of the season, and that's this past week against the Raiders. A really good matchup for sure. 16 total touches, cracks 100 rushing yards. You add the receiving yards, he goes for over 120 total yards, finds the end zone, puts up over 20 fantasy points for you. And finally, after a bunch of great matchups the past few weeks and Najee basically laying duds, barely getting to 9-10 fantasy points, we get a big week out of him this past game. And I mean, it was sick. We saw multiple explosive runs out of him at times. There was a 26-yard run, and then there was this run, which you probably saw all over your timelines because, I mean, how couldn't you? It looked like it was going to be once again Najee going for like a 2-3 yard gain, and somehow no Raiders can tackle him, the story of their season, and he breaks it off for a 36-yard rushing touchdown. This alone was where he got almost half of his fantasy points, 10 or so of his fantasy points on that explosive run, one of 2 explosive runs in the game for Najee, which really hasn't been a thing this year for him. So that's all good, but I have to admit, I have a pretty major concern with Najee Harris after this past game, which might sound crazy considering it was his best game game of the year, but look at this right here. In week 6, Najee saw a season low 48% of the rush attempts, and more importantly, 48% of the snaps. Now, why did this happen? Well, his teammate Jaylen Warren, who it looked like his knee was going to be a major issue, there was reports that he was going to be doubtful for week 6 early on in the week, and then all of a sudden, Jaylen Warren is practicing. All of a sudden, Jaylen Warren is active for the game, and all of a sudden, once again, Jaylen Warren, according to Fantasy Life right here, sees 34% of the snaps in this game, sees 21% of the rush attempts. Now, this is not anything elite in terms of usage, but it's his first game back from an injury, and it was enough to make Najee Harris see less than 50% of the snaps in this one. Like, Najee only played 6 more snaps than Jaylen Warren in that game, so kind of the usage in the big touchdown run is hiding the fact that this is once again a split backfield. And just to show you how much of a dramatic drop it was, I mean, in his last game in week 5 with Jaylen Warren and Cordell Patterson out, Najee Harris played 74% of the snaps, and that dropped down to just 48%. The other piece that is really interesting is the routes run. His receiving game usage, he goes from seeing 62% of the routes, 65%, to basically cutting in half or so to 36% of the routes run because Jaylen Warren was more involved. And believe it or not, this can actually get worse because Warren's only going to get healthier. His knee will only heal more moving forward, but that's not all. Cordell Patterson is likely going to return at some point. And way back in week 4, I say way back, but a couple weeks ago in week 4, Cordell Patterson was playing over Najee Harris in the first quarter. On his first 9 snaps, he picked up like 50 plus yards before suffering an ankle injury, but they were trying to give Cordell Patterson the workload over Najee. So this is kind of a red alert, a red alert to trade Najee Harris. My guess is this will be Najee's best performance of the season in terms of total yardage with all these other guys coming back. And you can see right here, Najee for me in my trades tool, my rest of season rankings, my 84th overall player, meaning these guys above him. Ladd McConkey 1-for-1 is definitely a trade. Rome Odunze on his bye week, you can probably get cheaper right now, is a trade target. Xavier Worthy coming out of his bye week, I'd rather have. Brian Robinson off of playing injured and missing a game in the game before that playing banged up, he's somebody that I would definitely go and try and get 1-for-1 deals done for a guy like Najee Harris. Now that tool you just saw was my rest of season rankings. It's my trade tool if you want to call it that, and it's just one of the small pieces that you can get access to with 21,000 other people in my fantasy blueprint. We won't be running this offer much longer, but if you want to get access to my fantasy blueprint, you just follow the link in the description below of this video and you just check out these 2 simple steps. It will take you to this page where you sign up through one of our 2 partners, either Underdog or Better. And again, the steps are linked right down below, pretty self-explanatory. But the reason why you want to sign up through one of our 2 partners this year is because when you do, the blueprint becomes risk-free this season when you sign up through a partner. Now, what does risk-free means? It means it's a one-time payment of $10 to get the blueprint all season long. Tools sent to you every single day for every single week of the year remaining. And if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, it's risk-free because I give you that $10 right back. You just got to reach out. So if you want to join the over 20,000 people who are currently using my blueprint, the tools to help them schmack around the competition, and you want to schmack around your league mates and your friends, well, scan this QR code that's on the screen to follow the steps, or you can just click the link in the description below to get access to that. The next player I think is worth trading away right now is a very talented player, an electric player, and Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions, and check out how good this dude has been. So far this season, the guy is averaging 22.8 yards per reception, number 2 in the NFL. He ranks 5th in yards per target, 12.6. He's just an explosive play weapon right now, and look, that's great. I can't say anything bad about how good he's been on a per touch basis, per reception basis. He's dominating downfield, but how consistent is this? Or the better question is, how consistent can it be moving forward? Because right now on the season, through 5 games, Jameson Williams only has 16 catches, barely 3 catches per game. So that's not an ideal role, but since he has these big touchdown plays, 3 of them so far this year, 50 plus yards, he's been able to sustain a top 20 fantasy football performance to this point. But here's the concern. According to Player Profiler, his expected fantasy points this year, based on his role, based on not really getting a lot of targets or usage, he's expected to be the wide receiver 38 in fantasy. Not all that valuable. Some weeks you're probably sitting him, if not most weeks. But right now he's actually the wide receiver 18 because he's getting these big touchdown plays that are just not historically consistent. You can't keep having 50 plus yard touchdowns on just 3 or 4 targets a week. Like, let's just look at his game logs right here. You can just look at his game logs. These last couple of weeks, you're looking at a guy who's getting 1 catch, 2 catch, 3 catches. Like the first 2 weeks, don't get me wrong. You look at this here, 5 catches on 9 targets, 5 catches on 11 targets. But then of course, Amon-Ra St. Brown got more involved. Jahmyr Gibbs got more involved. And now there's another wide receiver on this team, not named Amon-Ra St. Brown, not named Jameson Williams, who recently is getting involved. More on that in a second. Outside of these few big touchdown receptions he's had the past couple of weeks, I mean, you're really just 1 or 2 plays away from Jameson Williams putting up less than 5 fantasy points the past month of the season. That's atrocious. And I really don't think that this usage is going to change all that much because we know Detroit wants to run the ball first behind their great offensive line. Lean on David Montgomery, lean on Jahmyr Gibbs first. Then they want to play off of that in play action with Amon-Ra St. Brown, the guy who's going to see 10 plus targets most weeks. Sam Laporta, as of last week, started to slowly come around again. And as I mentioned earlier, there's another wide receiver in this receiving room that as of last week got involved in a pretty significant way. And that man's name is Tim Patrick, who you might not remember him. He was on the Denver Broncos. He's dealt with multiple different injuries, an Achilles and ACL, and he has not played the last 2 seasons, but this year he did. And this past week, he played 47% of the snaps snaps for the Detroit Lions, caught all 3 targets for 68 yards, and looked good out there. Again, this is a guy who in his first game or first real action with the team played nearly 50% of the snaps. There is something to that. Now, some of them did come later in the game in garbage time, but that was also the case for Amon-Ra St. Brown. Tim Patrick was playing in the first quarter and the first half as well. So I have to admit, I'm a little bit concerned for Jameson Williams, my 57th player rest of season, and right now I would 1-for-1 trade him for Jalen Waddle before Tua comes back, 1-for-1 trade him for Brian Robinson off of a down week. I think you can probably get these deals done, not now, but right now, especially off the past 2 weeks where Jameson has put up decent performances due to those big touchdown plays. Now, the next guy I want to talk about is Tony Pollard, and here's the deal. Tony Pollard is not somebody you should trade before week 7. I actually think you should trade him right after a favorable week 7 matchup. Now, Pollard exited his bye week in a really nice matchup against the Colts and once again put up 20 plus touches for the second straight game. He puts up 93 rushing yards, finds the end zone, and gets you a very nice 17 fantasy points. So here's what we're looking at for Tony Pollard. If we pull up his game log so far this season, a lot of good performances. You're talking about 4 to 5 games this year where he's had at least 15 fantasy points. 4 to 5 of these contests, week 1, week 2, week 4, and week 6 out of the bye week. This is a guy who has had 4 performances that are in the top 20, and most of them are in the top 15. He's been very stable and consistent, a quality player for your team. And the workload has been fantastic. Not only the past 2 games has he seen 20 touches per game, but on the entire season right now, he's averaging 20 opportunities per contest. And that workload should only stay strong right now because Tyjae Spears is dealing with a hamstring injury. He's considered week to week. Definitely seems like he's going to miss week 7, probably at risk of missing week 8 and week 9 since this is a hamstring injury and usually you miss multiple weeks. So all of this should have people going, okay, really wheels up for Tony Pollard. Top 15, top 10 running back most weeks. I had him as my running back 6 last week. That paid off. He played really well. But I do have one concern, and here it is. Pollard has earned 339 yards this season, and 353 of them have come after contact. Yes, you heard that right. The majority of his yards have come after contact. Negative 14 of them have come before contact. His offensive line isn't helping him. Some of this is on Pollard for not hitting the holes quickly, but if you watch the film, it's mostly his offensive line of young players, of some injuries there. They rank 24th on the season right now in run blocking, and if we look at Pollard's average defenders in the box, he currently is seeing 6.6 defenders in the box on average. That's more than half of the defense of 11 players, 13th in the NFL. That's not a good thing. There's a lot of defenders in the box. There's a lot of stack boxes that he's running into, the 15th most stack boxes in the league, and assuming Will Levis or Mason Rudolph, whoever is the quarterback, don't start playing better, that's only going to continue. And we've already seen something like this happen to Ramondre Stevenson the first 2 weeks of the season. He was getting all his yards after contact, offensive line wasn't helping him, but eventually that caught up to him, and it will for Pollard as well. Because you could only sustain breaking a ton of tackles and picking up yards after contact for so long, especially as a smaller running back around 205 pounds or so, and especially as the season goes on and you pick up more bangs and bruises and you maybe pick up an injury, you just can't keep doing this much after contact. So this week he has a nice matchup against the Buffalo Bills, one of the best, if not the best rushing matchups you can find right now, although he is a 9 to 10 point underdog, so that is a concern. Maybe you do want addition before this week, but assuming he could put up a decent performance against Buffalo, look at the schedule after that. On the road against the Lions, brutal. At home against the Patriots is fine. On the road against the Chargers, brutal. On the road or at home against the Vikings, not good. And then they play the Texans, not good. So you're talking about after this week, maybe you can say that the matchup against the Patriots is decent, but other than that, you're looking at 4 or 5 matchups in the next month or so that are terrible. I'm dishing away Tony Pollard either before this week when he's a 10-point underdog or right after if he does well in a nice matchup. And the next guy I want to bring up is Nick Chubb, who right now all signs are looking positive for Nick Chubb. He's been practicing the last 2 weeks heading into week 6 where he didn't play, and then now heading into week 7, he's practicing not in a limited fashion, but actually getting full practices in. And that's exciting. You can see right here, like this tweet, I got almost 100,000 views because people are excited. 31 retweets, over 700 likes right here because Nick Chubb practices in full, his first time in a full practice since returning from IR, since returning from that gruesome injury. But we've already kind of gotten some expectation setting from his head coach, Kevin O'Connell, saying like, we don't know what his role is going to be. We want to make sure he's here for the long term all season. So I think they're probably going to ramp him up for multiple weeks, if not like a month or two. Because a reminder, this isn't just Nick Chubb coming off of a knee injury or just something minor. No, he dislocated his knee, tore his MCL, ACL, messed up his PCL as well. And this is a spot where he had surgery in the preseason or had surgery before the preseason. He's been rehabbing the entire preseason, rehabbing through training camp. He's coming back in like 14 months for an injury that usually takes 18 to 24. So he's ahead of schedule. That's good. He's a freak athlete. We know that, but he's an older running back coming off of a gruesome injury. There's a lot of warning signs here. Like the return of Nick Chubb doesn't mean he's going to be instantly back to himself, right? It could take, like we said, a couple of weeks for him to ramp up. And even when he does ramp up, maybe he's just never the same guy again as an older running back coming back from this injury. Pierre Strong and Deontay Foreman will likely be involved this week and probably in future weeks as you have Jerome Ford dealing with a hamstring injury. So it's really a messy backfield right now. And even if you were to say that Nick Chubb comes back completely himself, the same guy he was where he left off, it's still like the worst situation in the NFL to be going into. Because right now the Browns offensive line, they are dealing with injuries, might get Wyatt Teller back off of IR soon, but they're still the 30th ranked unit in the NFL, which has been contributing somewhat to Deshaun Watson's bad play, and most of it is really just him right now not looking good. So you have arguably the worst quarterback in the NFL beyond one of of the worst offensive lines in run blocking and pass protection in the NFL, and you have an older running back coming back from a gruesome injury, I don't think there's a lot of good things here for Nick Chubb, but his stock is trending up just based on the fact that he is returning with name value. You also have the case that we should bring up that Amari Cooper is no longer on this team. So in terms of like the team actually putting together sustainable drives, whether it's with Deshaun Watson or Jameis Winston, like there's a decent chance they don't. How often is this team getting to the red zone where Nick Chubb can just get those short gimme touchdowns? I don't think it's going to happen all that much this year based on what we're seeing through the first 6 weeks of the season, which once again means how is Nick Chubb scoring fantasy points? Doesn't catch passes, might not be getting a full workload, and he's not going to be in the red zone all that often. I have Nick Chubb as my 86th player the rest of the season. So he is in my top 100, but if we redrafted today, he would be like an 8th or a 9th round pick, not somebody who's all that exciting. I think you should try and trade him right now for Ladd McConkey or Rome Odunze, who's coming off of his bye week or in his bye week like we mentioned earlier, or any of these other guys up here if you could. Michael Pittman, George Pickens off of a couple down weeks. I mean, you probably can't get Brian Robinson, but try and do it. Maybe somebody will take the name value of Nick Chubb, trade him right now before he comes back and maybe only plays 40% of the snaps and gets like 6 touches. And then trade his former teammate as well away if you can. Don't sell low, sell high here on Kareem Hunt, who in week 5, everybody got to see in Monday Night Football against the Saints, him have a big week, which means his stock is rising as he's coming out of his week 6 bye. Because in that game, Nick Chubb played 63% of the snaps, handled a very elite 75% of the running back opportunities out of the backfield, and he had a very solid game. I mean, the only other running backs who were seeing some work in that game, Samaje Perine to an extent, Carson Steele, who has now fumbled like 2 or 3 times in the NFL as an undrafted running back. Like, this is not the type of way you get more touches in the NFL. So what did we get instead? We got just Andy Reid relying on the guy he trusted, Kareem Hunt, who goes for over 100 rushing yards, who gets 28 touches in this game. But here's the thing, that's not going to happen again. Probably the rest of the season, might not even hit 20 touches the rest of the season. Because in that week 5 Monday Night Football game, the Chiefs, as you can see right here, which Brandon Kiley points out, ran 80 offensive plays, their most since December 20th, 2020. So about 4 years was the last time or so, 3.5, 4 years, that the Chiefs had that many plays in a game. So if that goes down by the 10 to 20% that it should heading into future weeks, then you're going to see 10 to 20 to 30% less carries for Hunt, and that's where he starts to get back to like a 16 to 18 carry ceiling, instead of these 27 rush attempts that we saw, his 1 reception. And the other thing to point out is that we're going to get Isaiah Pacheco back soon. Right here, Sports MD Analysis, a Harvard-trained surgeon, points out on Twitter, he says that Pacheco returns in week 10. And if that's the case, we're currently in week 7. So you get Hunt for week 7, 8, 9, and then that's about it until Isaiah Pacheco comes back. Now, I don't think that means that Pacheco is just going to instantly be back to his full-time workload. There'll probably be a couple of weeks where he's splitting a workload with Hunt, but all of the peak and high-end value for Hunt is going to be gone in probably 3 weeks, and it might be gone as soon as this week if he doesn't have a good performance. And he's also going to have more competition coming in because Clyde Edwards-Helaire, a former first-round pick, a player that the team re-signed this offseason, showing that they do have trust in him. He's coming back from an illness. He was dealing with PTSD, I believe, in some form, and he practiced in full on Wednesday for the first time this year. So he's trending to return in week 7. Who knows if he mucks up this backfield even more? Right now is just the time to be selling high on Kareem Hunt. And there's also another veteran who was a 4th-round pick and kind of had a stinker to the start of the year that you should be selling high on. That's the next guy we'll talk about. But right now, 65% of you are not subscribed to this channel, and we made it to that point in the video, fellas. Appreciate all of you that are subscribed, but this is the gentleman's agreement. If you made it this far, you find the videos helpful, enjoyable, insightful, whatever it might be, they help you out. And the only way you got to repay me is by hitting the subscribe button. These videos take like 6 to 7 to 8 hours to research, record, edit, get them up for all of you beautiful people. So appreciate it. Gentleman's agreement at this point in the video. Make sure you're subscribed. Now, that 4th-round pick I'm talking about is one Mark Andrews, who, if you're looking at it this past week, Mark Andrews has been struggling for most of the year, had his best game of the season. 3 catches on 4 targets, 66 yards, and a decent matchup, a good matchup against Washington, finds the end zone and puts up 15 fantasy points. So a lot of people now are saying, okay, Mark Andrews, these last couple of weeks, he seems to be back. You can see his fantasy points the last 2 weeks. You're getting 9.5 fantasy points, 15.6 on 55 receiving yards. That was a season high. Then he tops it again this past week with 66 receiving yards. So this is all good, right? Well, yes, for those past 2 weeks, it's been decent to good when he had a top 10 finish this past week, but it's just not sustainable. It's not something you can bank on moving forward. Because even in that week 6 game where he had his best game of the season on just 3 catches, mind you still had Isaiah likely playing 12 more snaps in this game. You can see right here, according to PFF, running the same amount of routes, seeing the same amount of targets. We know that Zay Flowers is more involved than he was last year. Rashad Bateman is looking better right now. So like at best, Mark Andrews is the 3rd or 4th option in this passing attack on a team that wants to run the ball a ton every single game with Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry. And also it should be noted that Mark Andrews' big play in this game of like 25 plus yards was when he was left wide open. They just didn't cover the guy. He was wide open. So look, the spot for Andrews right now isn't as bad as it was a couple weeks back when he was only running like 6 and 10 routes. This past game, he ran 18 routes. So that is good, but this is just one play or one game where you saw one explosive play because he was left wide open. And I don't think that should make you think that he's now going to be a top 5 to top tight end the rest of the season. He probably won't, so try and sell high. As of right now, Mark Andrews doesn't even make my rest of season rankings tool, meaning that I would rather have guys like Pat Freiermuth for sure over him. If you scroll down a little bit more, guys like Blake Corum for sure, Dontavian Wicks for sure. I mean, I would drop Mark Andrews still for these guys like Xavier Legette, Braylon Allen, no doubt about it. Cole Kmet at tight end, I'd rather have have rest of the season. All of those guys I just mentioned, then Mark Andrews. So assuming he's on your team, he's been on your bench, maybe now you try and sell him to another team who most teams need a tight end right now. Maybe you can kind of trick them into having Mark Andrews. Now, the next guy you got to trade, like not now, but right now, you probably already should have traded him by now, but it's time to get rid of Wan'Dale Robinson of the Giants. And look, here's the deal. It seems like finally Malik Nabers, who's missed the past 2 games with a concussion, he was officially limited in practice on Wednesday. Seems like he's trending to play. And if indeed that is the case, I think your days of being able to flex Wan'Dale Robinson the past few weeks with Nabers out and there being multiple teams on bye, I think those days are over. And this might be a bold prediction, but I could see people actually having to drop Wan'Dale in like 2 to 3 to 4 weeks because he's just that unreliable, which might seem like a crazy thing to say since he's second in the NFL right now in targets with 10 per game, 58 total, seeing a 28% target share, almost 29% target share. That's also top 10 in the NFL according to Player Profiler. Like, all these things are fantastic, and he's also coming off of another game where he saw yet again 10 plus targets for the 3rd time in his last 6 games this season. Puts up 10 fantasy points. Like, not the worst performance in the world, but how valuable are these targets? I asked this question 2 or 3 weeks ago when Wan'Dale was in this video. How valuable are these 10 plus targets from him? I would argue they're not that valuable, because out of these 11 targets that Wan'Dale Robinson saw this past week, 0 of them were downfield for 20 plus yards. 0 of them were in the red zone. And that's where you get a lot of your fantasy points. Downfield explosive plays or touchdowns, right? If you're not getting those, it's really hard for you to put up consistent fantasy production, especially when your target volume drops. And I hate to say it, but right now Wan'Dale Robinson is just basically like a pass catching running back for the most part. His average depth of target is 4.7 yards downfield. That's 95th in the NFL. That's not good. His yards per target this season, how many receiving yards he's getting on average per target? 4.8 yards, 87th in the NFL. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means in a game where he sees 10 targets, which is like really good, almost as good as it gets most weeks for wide receivers, he's averaging 48 receiving yards for you. That's brutal. And what happens when Malik Nabers returns from his concussion and he starts to see a lot of targets? What happens when Tyron Tracy is more involved in the offense because he's shown to be a great pass catching running back as a former receiver in college? What happens when the rookie tight end and Theo Johnson, who continues to see more and more playing time each week and getting more scheme touches? What happens when these guys start earning more targets? You want to know what happens? Wan'Dale Robinson goes from seeing 10 targets a game to 5 to 6 to 7, and now he's getting you 30 or 40 receiving yards and starting to become a droppable player for you. So before Wan'Dale Robinson, who was my 124th overall ranked player, not even in my top 100, before he starts to not get the targets and become a droppable player for you, trade him for anybody up here above. Trade him for his teammate Tyron Tracy. Trade him for DeAndre Hopkins, who's trending in the right direction out of the bye week this past week. Full-time role, actually healthy with that knee injury. Trade him for really anybody. Khalil Shakur, the wide receiver 2 now, won't see as much attention with Amari Cooper there. Jonathan Brooks, Isaiah Pacheco, these guys returning from injuries. I'd rather have all of those guys over Wan'Dale Robinson, who moving forward I think sees less volume, continues to be used in the short areas of the field, and is just not that valuable. So these are the players you should trade away before week 7, and a couple of them after week 7, as we discussed in detail. Now, if you want to see the guys you should be trading for this week, you can trade some of these guys away to get those players. The running back video and the wide receiver trade video are right here. You can check both of those out right there. Enjoy the rest of your week. Best of luck in your matchups week 7, and I'll see you in the next one.